So I down to the waterside, and there got a boat, and saw a lamentable fire. Everybody endeavoring to remove their goods. Poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats, or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. And among other things, the poor pigeons were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the windows and balconies till some of them burned their wings and fell down. Those are the words, David, of the great diarist Samuel Pepys. They're part of his account of what he witnessed in London on the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, the first night of the Great Fire of London. I'm Sarah Churchwell. Welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm David Olusoga, and this is the first of our 2 episodes on the Great Fire of London. This week, we're going to explore how the fire started and how it completely ran out of control in that first day. Next week, we're going to explore the final 3 days of the fire. Those who remember our episode on the Great Storm of 1703, you might remember that we kept comparing the death toll of the Great Storm to the death toll of the Great Fire. So we thought we may as well explore that event, those 2 events within half a century of each other. But the Great Fire is the one that in some ways is totally different to the Great Storm because we absolutely do remember it. It is etched into our culture. It's one of the first things that you learn at school doing history. If you're brought up in the United Kingdom, my daughter came home, she must have been 6, and it was, I think, literally the first thing she'd learned. Then you do Romans, and then you do dinosaurs and that sort of stuff.
So it's like the originary event. Before dinosaurs, there was the Great Fire, of London. It's interesting because, of course, outside of the UK, it is more of a historical footnote, as you might expect. We hear about it, probably through nursery rhymes and the like, but you don't really study it. And I didn't learn the real story until I started learning history as an adult. But, once I started digging into it, it is an amazingly fascinating story. And it is one of those stories that you really need to deep dive into to really understand what happened and why it happened.
Yeah, because we think we know it. We know some details, and those details are really important. But there's so much more that went on that made what could have just been an ordinary fire that would barely be a blip on the historical record into a catastrophe. So in this episode, we're going to paint a picture of what people were thinking and what they were feeling as they were going through those 4 days of the fire. This is very much social history. It's about everyday Londoners' experiences of those terrible days. But we will also talk about the big characters. We began with Samuel Pepys, the diarist. This is also a story that involves the King, King Charles II, and his brother, James, the future King James II.
You say we're going to do this from a kind of social history perspective, which is how we like to approach things. And sometimes we talk about social history as being from the bottom up or from the ground up. And it's a really appropriate way of thinking about the Great Fire, isn't it? Because that literally started from the ground up. We also say, we love a story about unintended consequences and contingency. And this is something that starts from the ground up and builds out of the control of everyone around it and then changes everything.
This is one of those rare moments when it literally is a domestic story. It happens in a home, and then it becomes a national story that has a profound impact on British history. But we should begin with London on the eve of the fire, that London of 1666.
You mentioned in your notes, David, and I really like this idea that the Great Fire, one of the things it really marks is the end of Shakespeare's London. And so the day before the fire is kind of the last day of Shakespeare's London. That's what we're looking at. The 1st of September, 1666 was the last day that the city that Shakespeare would have recognized exists. It's the last day of the Tudor, almost medieval London. It doesn't know it's the last day, but it is powerful to think that that was the eve of the erasure of that city. But that city is both enormous by the standards of the 17th century, and it is also absolutely tiny compared to modern London. It's hard, I think, for people who know London well, or even, probably have seen it in movies or whatever, to realize how small it was at this point. And it's within the bounds of the old city walls, isn't it?
There's the city of London, which is inside the medieval walls that trace the Roman walls. Then outside, they're what you would think of as suburbs. But the parts that are suburbs in 1666, we would now think of as central London.
They're like zone 1 and zone 2 at most now.
I mean, parts of the city like Oxford Circus that we absolutely think as being in the heart of London are empty fields outside the city. So it's the financial centre today. It's this old city of London. That's where the fire takes place. But this is a city of 450, maybe 460,000 people. There's various estimates, but that's the one historians have gravitated around. Modern London is about 9 million people. So this tiny city of less than 500,000, that is what the London of 1666 was like. So by the standards of the time, it was a giant. It was by a mile the biggest city in England. And that disparity between the size of London and the size of the next cities, that continues today, as does the idea that Londoners have a character, an individual character. Anyone living in London in 1666 had to be tough. This was a city with an incredibly high mortality rate, a very high infant mortality rate. And in the summer of 1666, this was a city of people who were traumatized because they'd just been through the plague.
It's been a really bad stretch by any imagination, right? So you've got, as you say, a terrible year of plague, but also anybody who was adult would also have remembered the Civil War, which has only just ended at the same time.
Yeah. People will have memories of the Civil War. Some people might have memories of the execution of Charles I in 1649. This is a city, though, that had begun 1666, thinking this was going to be another year of plague. In 1665, as many as 80,000 people may have died of the plague out of a city of about 450,000. People who caught the plague almost always died. The death rate was about 90%. This is what people have just been through, and they've begun 1666 fearing that when the summer came, the temperatures went up, the plague would return. And they were also fearful of 1666 because of those numbers.
Well, and you're fearful in that kind of disease where you're looking at 90% mortality rates from a disease, particularly if you live in a time where you don't understand the spread of disease, you don't understand germ infection, you don't know where this stuff is coming from, and catastrophe seems to spring up out of nowhere, which of course, relates to people's faith structures as well. But so, your babies are dying and you don't know why, your family is dying, you don't know why. Suddenly these things are all spreading and you don't know why. And so you struggle to make sense of that, don't you? And so one of the things we see is people looking everywhere for indications of what the next year is going to be like.
And the next year, for numerical reasons, was a year that people, not just since 1665, but since the 16th century, decades earlier, had been fearing. The advent of this year, 1666, 666. People had lived in fear for almost a generation of the coming of this year.
We can laugh a little bit at the superstition of the idea that the year that has the mark of the devil will be the year that will bring, catastrophe. But David, you and I are both old enough to remember the fears of the coming of the millennium, which is no less arbitrary. And everybody was certain that come Y2K, everything was going to fall apart and it was going to be an apocalypse. And everybody was really worried about it. So we should, pause before we are too mocking of, the superstitions of yore, because we have our own. And so they felt that 1666 or like 1984, right? This big symbolic year that has been looming and they've been waiting for. And so they're primed for disaster.
And there's a general feeling at this moment that these maybe are the end times, this series of disasters, war, regicide, plague. The idea that the world was coming to an end is an idea being pushed by very many radical preachers. There'd also been portents. There'd been comets in the sky. Christopher Wren had seen them through a telescope and described them in his diaries. And there were preachers and prophets on the streets of London warning about a coming disaster. There was a Quaker preacher called Solomon Eagle, and he walked the streets of London with a bowl of fire strapped to his head, warning that judgment was coming. And in the 17th century, judgment often meant judgment by fire. The Bible is full of stories of cities destroyed by fire.
I just have a lot of questions about Solomon Eagle and the fire strapped to his head. It is a little hard to picture, isn't it, that this man walking around, and you just ask yourself, how did he not set his hair on fire? How did the bowl stay on? How did all of these things? But it's also, I found myself just thinking, are we absolutely sure that we know the origins of the fire? Because if there was a man wandering around with a bowl of fire on his head, maybe he has something to answer for. Could it really have been Solomon Eagle? It's like the literal definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here you go. I think fire is coming. Well, it is now, Solomon. You just knocked your bowl of fire over. Sorry, he just made me laugh.
And yet, despite that, in the summer of 1666, just before the fire, there was a feeling that maybe just perhaps things were going to get back to normal. King Charles, who had fled the city during the plague, had returned. The rich were sending big trains of carts with their possessions on back to their big houses in London. And the city was beginning to come back to life. The streets were busier again. Trade was increasing. There was a sense that maybe the worst was over. But the summer of 1666 didn't bring the plague. What it did bring was a drought. It was unusually hot and there was very little rain. And that was the seeds of a new disaster.
Well, what could possibly go wrong if everything is dry and everything is hot and we are in a medieval city, especially if you have a preacher wandering around with a bowl of fire on his head? I'm not going to let Solomon Eagle go.
But if you think about the shape of that medieval city, what it's built of, it is difficult to think what people could have done to make it a greater fire risk. The overwhelming majority of buildings are wooden. They are lath and plaster with wooden posts and wooden boards. There is some brick, but it's overwhelmingly a wooden city. To make matters even worse, houses are waterproofed by coating them in pitch, which is made from coal and tree resin, which is even more flammable.
And that's to make your house waterproof. So you can either be waterproof or you can be fireproof, but you can't be both. And they were choosing waterproof over fireproof.
Yeah. So you have this city of wooden buildings covered in pitch. Some of them have got thatched roofs, even though they're not supposed to because of building regulations. And you have this at a moment when the only form of light are candles and the only form of heat is open fires, wood or coal. So you have a highly flammable city in an age when fire is absolutely an essential of life. And so unsurprisingly, London was a city where there were regularly, routinely house fires that broke out. Pepys, in his great diary, Samuel Pepys, mentions 19 other fires other than the Great Fire, which he just encounters and mentions in passing because they're not a great deal. And they're just the ones he saw.
So it's basically the equivalent of like a car accident today, isn't it? That it's a kind of normal accident. It's the sort of thing that you know is terrible. It's horrible for the people affected by it, but it's isolated, it's contained, and it kind of is a daily occurrence. And you know, oh, dude, that was too bad. There was a big car crash there, and you might, rubberneck, or it causes whatever knock-on consequences. But it doesn't bring everything to a standstill. Yeah. It's just like a car accident.
People were accustomed to fires and people have found ways of controlling fires. But this is still a city of wooden buildings, narrow streets, houses that projected up from the upper floors towards each other. Sometimes you could, people who were neighbors could shake hands because their houses, the upper floors were so close to each other in a medieval street pattern of winding lanes. This was a tinderbox by the summer of 1666.
But as you've been saying, to a certain extent, such fires are a fact of life, but the Great Fire is very much not an ordinary fire. So let's take a break there, and we'll come back on the eve of the Great Fire and find out what it was that actually changed everything and made the Great Fire the ultimate catastrophe that it was. So welcome back to Journey Through Time. It is the 1st of September, 1666. And there's been a dry summer that left London vulnerable. But something changes. In fact, two things happen that come together and make the Great Fire of 1666 possible.
That's right. There were two elements, and both of them are needed. The first is the story that we all know. We said at the beginning, this is the first thing you learn when you're a kid at school, in a British infant school, and that's Pudding Lane. Pudding Lane in 1666, it was like a fast food street. It was where you went because you wanted to get a pie, you wanted to get some food on the go. It was really busy round the clock, particularly at lunchtime. At the end of the working day, on the 1st of September, a baker called Thomas Fariner was finishing his workday. His bakery wasn't a bakery in the modern sense, it was just part of his house. It was a bakehouse, probably at the back on the ground floor. And he was getting ready for the next day. He was raking through the coals of the oven to snuff out the last embers of the fire. He's done this 1,000 times. He's been a baker for years.
Well, this is according to Ferner, though, isn't it?
It is, and he is cagey about the details of what happened, and with good reason. What he tells us is that he and his family went to bed in the floors above the bakehouse. So his daughter Hannah, his son Thomas, and their maid. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, they were awoken. Thomas runs upstairs because smoke was starting to come up the stairs and through the rafters into the bedrooms above. The fire had broken out in the bakehouse below. It was already so powerful that they couldn't get down the stairs and out of the house. So they climbed through a window and went over the roof to a neighbor's house and then kind of broke in and escaped that way. Thomas Fariner, his son and his daughter Hannah all survived. Hannah was a little burnt. The maid, who was scared of heights, wouldn't leave. She wouldn't go out on the rooftop. If she slipped, she would have died, and she was frightened of heights. She is the first victim of the Great Fire of London.
And the records don't tell us her name, do they? The servant women don't actually really get a look in. So it's like the tragedy is compounded by the fact that the history records Ferner and his family, and then this poor young woman who's just terrified. Yeah. First victim, no name.
Wrong gender, wrong social class, a detail of history. When those who survive, Thomas Fariner, his son and his daughter, get into the street, they do what you do in London in the 17th century. They shouted, "Fire, fire, fire." The wood that had been stored, which was used to fire the ovens in the bakehouse, meant that there was a lot of fuel for this fire. But it was just another fire at this moment. And so people did what they knew to do, which is that they adopted the normal firefighting techniques that were part of life in the 17th century.
Right, because as we've been saying, fires were really common. I mean, in fact, when you read the story for the first time, I remember it striking me as people were kind of weirdly blasé about fires. I mean, house fires today are a big deal. But they were just sort of like, oh, it's a fire, because you say they knew what to do. They would come out, everybody played their part, and they knew what it was that was expected of them.
Yeah, and it was really organized. In the local churches, there were ladders for getting up buildings. The city watchmen would always look out for fires, and they would join in the fight when a fire was discovered. There were firefighting buckets around the city. There were pipes under the streets that could be broken and water brought to the site of a fire. So at this point, the bakery's gone. Thomas Fariner's bakery is in flames. Perhaps a couple of the neighboring houses are going to be damaged or destroyed, but this is a fire that people are convinced and confident will just be brought under control.
So we're still at a point where it just looks like normal human error and that it's going to be manageable. But very quickly, things start to change.
The fire doesn't behave in the way that fires normally do. It's moving rapidly from house to house on Pudding Lane. Now, archaeologists have suggested one of the reasons for this might have been that a neighbouring house was storing pitch, which is used to coat houses, used to coat ships, highly flammable. But the key factor was the wind. That was the other factor that turned the fire on Pudding Lane into the Great Fire of London. And to understand that, we have to go back 24 hours to Saturday, the 1st of September, and what was happening 90 miles away.
So we've been mentioning some of the conditions that are going to lead to the Great Fire of 1666, but there's a wider one that we haven't talked about yet, which is that England in 1666 was yet again, as it was so often during this period, at war with one of its neighbors.
That's right, and it's an event in that war that explained the other factor that turned the fire in Pudding Lane into the Great Fire. 2 fleets of warships were heading towards each other in the English Channel. An English fleet and a Dutch fleet. This is the middle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. And this is what people were talking about in London in the summer of 1666, the war. This was the big story, not some fear of fire, not worrying about the drought or how flammable the city was. Everyone was obsessed with the war, and this was going to be the decisive battle. The English were going to rout the Dutch. The Dutch ships were off the French coast near Boulogne, and as the English fleets got closer and they began to engage the Dutch, everything fell apart because a wind rose in the channel, and it became impossible for the ships to fight one another. Masts were being lost, sails were being ripped, and so the 2 fleets, rather than fighting each other, scuttled home. They rushed for safety in the closest port they could get to. So this battle, the Battle of Boulogne, 1666, never happened. It's not in the history books. It's a sort of non-event.
When we teach, this is literally what we mean when we teach the contingency of history, right? That sometimes these certain conditions just come together in a way that makes something happen that was not at all preordained. Here, just as Farriner's maid is getting trapped upstairs, the wind comes rushing in and changes everything.
Yeah. So the wind that had prevented this battle from happening arrives in London at exactly the time that this fire is taking place, is starting in Thomas Farriner's bakery. That's why it's not behaving normally. That's why the early attempts to control this fire aren't quite happening. But it still probably could have been contained in those first couple of hours had people acted more dramatically, more decisively. And at this point, one of the great kind of villains of this story enters the stage, the Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Bloodworth.
He doesn't really cover himself with glory, does he, David? We had a similarly unimpressive mayor a little while ago with the Astor Place riots, the mayor of New York, who also did not help a bad situation. And here, I've emerged from this story not a fan of Bloodworth, let's put it that way.
And he's an unfortunate figure. He is not one of history's. Yeah. I feel sorry for him.
I don't.
He's not up to the scale of the task. And what he should have done is very clear. The firefighting using ladders, using water wasn't working. The next stage in firefighting of the 17th century, everyone knew you pull down the nearby buildings to create a fire break to stop the fire spreading in a tightly packed wooden city. The problem is that as Lord Mayor of London, he's someone who's a businessman, and he's acutely aware that these houses have owners, but the owners aren't the people living there. The people living there are tenants. He decides he cannot pull down these buildings, even though he's Lord Mayor, unless he gets permission at 2 o'clock in the morning to pull them down from owners, and no one knows where they are.
I mean, okay, you can understand him being afraid of, a lawsuit, but ultimately he's not taking the action that needs to be taken. He's actually the person with the authority on the scene, in the situation, and he's waiting for a higher authority, which is one of the reasons why I don't have any respect for him. Another is that not only was he dismissive about the fire when he first saw it, but he famously said when he saw the fire that it was so negligible that, and I quote, a woman could piss it out.
It's not one of history's great lines, is it?
I mean, it's pretty gratuitously sexist. And the idea that he's going to blame the women, given how he's about to go and behave, when you know what's coming, when you read that line, it's a bit like, pipe down, mate. You're not about to show the women how it's done. So no, I'm afraid I lost my sympathy for him. But also because, as you're saying, there's this kind of pusillanimous, aspect to his response of just being like, oh, I don't want to, piss people off. I don't know what it's burning down, dude. You need to do something. And, this isn't just hindsight, right? Rebecca Radille, in her wonderful History 1666, has a blistering quote from an observer at the time who noted that the first people to encounter the fire, including Sir Thomas Bloodworth, he said these people had neither brains nor hands to prevent the city's ruin. Like it wasn't rocket science, guys. You had a brain and some hands. You should have stopped it. You could have stopped it, and they didn't. So I think it's generous of you to be sympathetic to Sir Thomas Bloodworth, but I'm not gonna join that compassion.
There were people around him saying this was the right thing to do, and he hesitated. This big moment for this very big decision came, and he just didn't act. And that decision to not act, that's what condemns London to disaster, because that really is the last chance when this fire could have been controlled, because it is fanned and fueled by the wind, and that wind is escalating.
Well, that's why something like that kind of misjudgment matters, right? We can be sympathetic to human misjudgment, and that's certainly what this is. But it's so consequential because he's assuming that there are no other factors in play. And yet, surely they could start to feel the gale force winds whipping around them, presumably, and start to recognize that something is going to happen. And very quickly, it does, doesn't it? It's out of control. Once he makes that fateful decision, it gets out of control very fast.
Well, the next report we have of the fire is from probably about an hour later, 3 a.m. And this is when it comes to the attention of the great diarist Samuel Pepys. Now, we should explain Pepys, who is famous for his diary, but at the time, his job was he worked at the Navy Board. He was a member of Parliament. He was a sort of member of the elite, a supporter of the Stuart royal family.
But you mentioned his diary. And of course, that is why he's so famous today. He kept this incredibly detailed daily account all the way through the 1660s of what life was like. So it's a complete social history goldmine. And he writes about everything from the prices of food to gossip to who he saw at the theater to what everybody's wearing.
And his complicated love life.
Well, you could call it a love life. I was not going to let him I'm very fond of Samuel Pepys, but you're right. I was not going to let him get away with that. We would call him handsy at a minimum. Yes, he...
even during the fire.
Oh, yeah, even during the fire. Everything's an opportunity for Samuel Pepys. So, I mean, he records in his diary groping maids and assaulting shop girls and molesting his friends' wives. So, I mean, and this is what he records. So
in between the molestations, he describes the politics of Restoration Britain. Pepys in his diary gives us this amazing account of the fire, but he's not just a witness. He's not just someone who's writing down what happens. He's involved.
That's what makes, I think, this moment in his diary so interesting and so exciting. Because often he's just observing, right? But here he's actually the protagonist, not the protagonist, but he's a protagonist. And he's telling the story of the ways in which he was actually very actively involved in the fire. So suddenly his funny, gossipy diary just leaps to life in the catastrophe.
Yeah, and it becomes tragic and it becomes dramatic and it becomes very, very visual in the way he describes this calamity. At 3 a.m., he's woken up, and a bit like Thomas Bloodworth, he underestimates the fire. His maid, Jane Birch, wakes him up to say there is a great fire in the city. Pepys goes to a window, and for the first time, he sees the fire. Now, his house is pretty close to Pudding Lane. He's on a place called Seething Lane, but he decides the fire is not serious enough for him to really worry about. So he goes back to bed.
Not for the last time in this story that someone's going to go back to bed. City's burning, but a lot of people go back to bed.
One of the really amazing things about his diary over these few days is it gives us something like a timeline. 4 hours later, he's woken up again by the same maid, Jane Birch, who tells him that she hears that above 300 houses have been burnt down tonight by fire. That's what Pepys writes in his diary. So between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m., this fire has enormously expanded. And Pepys now realizes that this is not just another house fire.
Well, while he was snoozing, his maid was on the job, actually, finding out what was happening. And other people are doing the work and monitoring. But I'm having a little bit of fun at Pepys's expense, but now he actually starts to rise to the occasion.
We think the maids are up late because Pepys had a dinner party planned for that evening. So they were up getting ready for the dinner party, which allowed them to be awake to witness the fire, to wake him up twice. But at this point, 7 o'clock, he knows it's serious. He goes to the Tower of London. He's close to the constable of the tower, and he climbs up and he gets his first view. By this point, the fire that started in Pudding Lane has been fanned by the flames of the gale that is blowing over London for 6 hours. And it's at that moment in his diary that Pepys uses the word that we use, that people in the 17th century used to describe the fire. Great. He calls it an infinite great fire.
Although infinite is actually, in some ways, so much more frightening than great, isn't it?
That word comes up so much. John Eveling, another writer who writes another diary, who's another great figure of this story, he uses the word infinite as well. It's a very powerful word in the 17th century.
As you say, it's powerful in all kinds of ways, but it also gives that sense that they start to convey, and it starts to happen at this point, doesn't it? We get this imagery of like the sky being on fire, this sense that it isn't just the city burning, but that, something really catastrophic is happening. And it's at this moment that Pepys understands, right?
What's happened between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. is that the fire has got to the Thames. Pudding Lane's quite close to the Thames. The fire has burnt down, and lining the Thames are warehouses. This is where the merchants of London store their goods from the East India trade, the West India trade, the trade with Europe. And there are huge wooden warehouses full of pitch, of rope hemp, of oil, of things that are highly, highly flammable, stored in huge quantities.
So the worst possible place for the fire to head is exactly where the wind is sending.
Yeah. The gale is blowing the fire from east to west. Pudding Lane is in the east of the old walled city. It's pushing the fire down towards the river and west to where the bulk of the old city is. And it hits Thames Street and those warehouses, I mean, the accounts of them, it sounds like they'd almost explode. There's so much in them that is flammable.
As you say, there's so much stored there that it's inevitable that it's going to feel like it was hitting, a powder keg, that it was hitting explosives. But in fact, if things had taken just a slightly different turn, that's exactly what could have happened.
Yeah. If the wind had been in the opposite direction, blowing from west to east, it would have blown the fire towards the Tower of London. And in there was not sort of hemp and oil and flammable materials. Inside the Tower of London were the artillery, remember England's at war, and about 600 tons of gunpowder. So the great fear at this moment is that the fire will reach the tower. But the wind is blowing, thankfully, blessedly, in the opposite direction. But there's still a very, very real danger that the fire will go up. But if it goes west, if the fire is pushed west, there's another target, there's another risk, which is what is then a suburb, the suburb of Westminster and Whitehall. Westminster, then as now the seat of Parliament, Whitehall, then the court of King Charles II.
It's still hard to get my head around the idea of Westminster being a suburb. I know I know we've covered this already, but it's still hard to
it's
still hard
such
to think in those terms.
tiny London, and it's very, very hard to imagine a London that minuscule. Pepys gets in a boat and goes down to Westminster as if he's sort of leaving London to go to another town. But London is the old walled city, the suburb of Westminster and Whitehall, and the areas outside the walls. It's all central London to us.
But so on this night in that suburb of Westminster, that's where the king is. So the danger then is not only to the property of London, but to the government and indeed the monarch itself.
Yeah. So Pepys, a figure who is known to the king, a figure who's part of the elite, a member of parliament, gets on a boat, travels down to Whitehall, and is given an audience with King Charles II, and he explains to the king what the situation is in London.
This is why it's so helpful. I mean, we were saying before that Pepys, did have a senior position in government, but we need to be thankful that he did, because he could get the ear of the king. Because if he had been, any more lowly, he probably wouldn't have gotten, a look in. But since he has access and he's got real responsibilities, he was able to get there, and he was taken seriously. More importantly, again, if it had been a maidservant, she would have just been dismissed.
Pepys informs the king what's happening in London, and that there was a desperate need to start pulling down houses. The king gives him the command to spare no houses. And Pepys is then sent back into London to go and find Thomas Bloodworth, the mayor, and to make him do what he hadn't done several hours earlier and start pulling down houses. When he finds the Lord Mayor, Pepys has to sort of elbow his way up these streets. People are pouring out of their houses with their possessions. He finally finds Thomas Bloodworth, who is near hysterical, and gives him the king's orders. And Bloodworth says that they are pulling down houses, but that the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it. And that's another indication that this is not a normal fire. This is the power of a fire plus the power of the wind, of a gale force wind. Bloodworth also makes yet another bad call, the second of the night. The king had offered the use of his lifeguards, the royal lifeguards. There's no standing army at this point, but he does have a military force. And Thomas Bloodworth rejects the help of the king from the soldiers.
I mean, Thomas, what are you thinking? Why wouldn't you say, yes, we need all hands on deck?
It's probably because of memories of the Civil War. We're not that far away from when the Royalist army marched through the gates of London. So the idea of the army in London, that's a sort of sore nerve. Then, and this is the point when I'm not going to even attempt to try to defend Thomas Bloodworth, because as well as rejecting the help of the Royal Lifeguards when he needs every man he can possibly get to fight this fire, he tells Pepys that he's exhausted and he literally goes home to bed. I mean, leadership.
Exactly, right? I mean, I was having a little fun at Samuel Pepys's expense for just, going back to bed, but he thought it was an ordinary fire. But the idea of just totally abdicating all responsibility. I mean, it's literally Pontius Pilate. He's like washing his hands like, see you later. You're on your own, guys.
You are Lord Mayor of a city. The city is on fire and he goes home to bed.
I mean, there are so many comedy scenes in films that I have, that I am picturing of, the moment of the standoff where the guy just like runs away, which is basically what this is.
So by this point, it is daylight. London has awoken to see the scale of the fire. And this is a really important moment. People's first reaction, perhaps understandably, is not to rush to fight the fire, but to rush to preserve and protect their own possessions. The city is just taken over with people rushing out of their homes to get their stuff away from this advancing fire.
I mean, as you say, it's sort of understandable. And I've been making these analogies to car accidents, but this moment does slightly remind me of airline flights when they say, in the event of an emergency, leave your hand luggage behind. And they have to say that on every flight, presumably because we all know by now that human nature is that even in an emergency, people would be like, what about my stuff? Instead of banding together to actually deal with the emergency. And that's what we see here, isn't it?
And I think it's still about underestimating the emergency. And we can tell this because people will take their prized possessions and they'll move them a couple of streets away because they presume this fire is not going to get that far. And in the way they act, we can tell that they're still underestimating the scale of this disaster. They're still not quite seeing the position that the city's in. Some people are reported to have moved their possessions 4 or 5 times in a day because the fire keeps on advancing.
But you think at that point you start to work it out. You'd be like, hang on, this is getting bad. It keeps going and I have to keep moving stuff. But nobody is kind of doing the math.
It's a refusal to believe that this could be possible. What we also see on this Sunday, the first day of the fire, is profiteering. People who own carts, people who own boats on the river, they up their prices for the cost of taking people's possessions to safety. It cost a few shillings to hire a cart on the 1st of September, 1666. On the first day of the fire, the 2nd of September, it can cost £30 or £40, over £100,000 in today's money, because people understand that those with possessions and luxuries are desperate to save them from the flames.
I mean, it's a lot of money when you put it in that context. So yeah, I guess, there are a lot of lessons from this about how things haven't changed. And I guess disaster capitalism is something else that's always with us.
And I think also people who own carts in a city have enormous disparities between rich and poor. This is their payday. Yeah, this is a city of slums as well as of grand houses.
Right. Like, okay, I'm going to make my money from the rich guy.
If your business is owning a cart and suddenly, a rich guy will pay you £30.
Fair enough.
I got a bit of sympathy.
Okay. No, I'm with you.
That's the socialist in me kicking in.
This time you've persuaded me. I'm with you. Okay.
One of the real tragedies, and we'll explain why in our following episode, is that the publishers and the stationers, the people who produce books, they gather all of their stock and they put it in what they think is the safest place in London, which is St. Paul's Cathedral. And there's really good reasons to think that St. Paul's Cathedral is the safest place to store papers in this fire. Not just because it's a stone building in a city of wooden buildings, not just because the walls are so thick, but it's also because it had an almost natural fire break around it. It was in a kind of piazza. So the fire break that people are trying to build by pulling down houses is already stamped into the shape of the city around St. Paul's. But that, as we'll discover, that decision was going to be a disaster. If you look at all of the accounts of the fire at this point, as we get to the end of Sunday the 2nd, the first day, this fire is not behaving in any way the way fires traditionally did in London. And there are some people who've argued that it was becoming a firestorm, that the heat and the wind and the movement of air caused by the fire was feeding. It was becoming self-sustaining, as it were. John Evelyn, who's a great writer and a diarist of this moment, he talks about the sound of the fire. He said it was like thousands of chariots driving over cobblestones. There are descriptions in Pepys and elsewhere of this great arc of fire in the sky. I mean, imagine that everything around you is coloured by the flames, yellows and oranges, and above you is this thick black smoke. This is a city you know. These are streets you walk. This is a place that's deeply familiar to you. And it looks completely otherworldly. It looks like a sort of landscape you've never seen before. People describe the fire almost as if it's supernatural.
Yeah, you mentioned Evelyn there, and he has this incredibly vivid description of the kind of unfolding of the Great Fire, the way that it happens. You know, he describes it happening kind of almost in slow motion, doesn't he? But he also talks about how the people of London kind of didn't know what to do. So we've been saying how they were going and saving their possessions, but in another sense, they're kind of in headless chicken mode.
He has a great view of the fire as well, because John Evelyn lives in Deptford, so he's on the south side of the river, and he can see in a way that somebody who's in front of, in the middle of the city, surrounded by the fire can't. He can see the scale of it.
So that's the end of what is only the first day of the Great Fire of London. And it's already clear at this point, as we're saying, that the fire is starting to rage beyond control.
I think we can also wonder whether it's the end of people believing that this is a fire that could be halted. Think about the day people have just been through. They've woken up and discovered there's a fire in the city. They now have to try to get some sleep, knowing their city is on fire, knowing that the next day when they awake, the fire might be closer to their homes, that it could be their property that's destroyed next. Already in those first 24 hours, 1,000 houses and shops have been destroyed. Churches, stone-built churches, not just wooden buildings, have already been consumed by the flames. And now, with that realization that this fire is not behaving the way fires normally do, that the normal procedures for fighting fires just aren't working, and that the wind that's blown in from the channel is still blowing at gale force, the realization that maybe London's at risk, maybe this is something unimaginable, maybe this is the end times, maybe this is the premonitions of that year 1666, 666, maybe that's coming to pass. They had to try to get some sleep with no idea what they were going to wake up to.
So, on that note, I think we have to say join us next time for the second episode of The Great Fire of London, when the fire, there's a little bit of a plot spoil, but the fire does indeed spread. Pepys will decide what to save, and royalty will enter the story rather more decisively than it has so far. We'll also find out how the fire finally did come to an end, and what came next for the capital that almost didn't survive. Join us next time.
Thank you for listening.